Hello and welcome to the Room of Lives. I'm your host, Neil. We are talking today with my former colleague, Rishi, who is a neuroscientist. In this episode, we discuss the research that he has done so far. We talk about the trade-off in the functioning of the human brain between specialization and generalization, and how different parts of the brain might work at different timescales. We also discuss distributed computing in the brain. How do millions of neurons do something together without a single organizing center? Rishi explains how he uses the lens of math and computer science to understand how our brains are able to pack a lot of memories so efficiently and recover them correctly when needed. And we talk about his research of using math to find patterns in the neural firing of mouse brains while they are awake and asleep. Okay, so this next section is going to be about science and philosophy. So you kind of described a little bit the themes in which you have been interested and worked, but can we get into some more details without making it too technical on what you have researched so far? This includes your PhD and your postdocs.
So my PhD I did
so let's just imagine that you're trying to communicate to the intelligent layperson what you have researched on.
So I did a few things in my PhD, but really just to focus on one kind of idea that comes up in a lot of places. There's this interesting trade-off in the brain between specialization and sort of generality. So if you look at the neocortex, which is the sheet that makes up a lot of what we think of as our brain, you'll see this repeated pattern. It looks like the neurons in different places seem like they're organized in the same way. You kind of got this repeating motif. And at the same time, you see very different computations carried out in different parts of your brain. Some parts of your brain are there to track early sensory information. Light flashes, they're responding to it quickly. Other parts of your brain are looking at trying to store memories over time or help you to make complex decisions. And so there's this tension in this interesting question. On the one hand, if you look at the brain, you might think, oh, it's just this very general purpose computational machine. It's like we've got the same chip or the same structure repeated across the brain. On the other hand, you might say, well, we've got these different modules that are doing different things. So how do these two perspectives link together? And how does the anatomy actually specialize? What lets parts of the brain do one thing and other parts of the brain do other things? And so one thing I kind of zoomed in on, or one thing that I focused on, was this notion that there are different time scales in different parts of the brain. So as you're talking to me, one part of your brain is really keeping track of every syllable, every word. It's tracking what's going on in the environment from moment to moment. And another part of your brain is trying to zoom out, trying to make sense of it in a broader context, trying to maybe link it to something I said 10 sentences ago, or to philosophy, or to something someone else has told you about the brain. And you tend to see these different time scales in different parts of the brain.
This has been shown experimentally. In the context of language processing?
In the context of a number of different tasks, in the context of language processing, in the context of just if you look at spontaneous fluctuations in the brain and look at how long they take to vanish, it's almost like if you push a pulse of current into a part of the brain, how long does that region of the brain hold information around? And so I did a bunch of both modeling and theoretical studies trying to link some of the facts we know about anatomy, how the brain's wired up, to what we know about dynamics, how the parts of the brain change their activity over time, and then to function. And so one of the ideas that emerged from this is that as you get to parts of the brain that are responsible for more abstract thought or responsible for more complex decision making and things like that, they become more recurrent. they tend to bounce information around longer. They talk to each other more. And you can see this in the anatomy. There was this very interesting set of papers. This Guy Elston, just looking at neurons from different parts of the brain across species, and you see these big changes, not that are quantitative changes, not qualitative, but the neurons become bigger, they have more connections, and so on. And if you put those changes into a model, you start to get these qualitative differences where different parts of the brain can do different things.
They actually put this in a when you say in a model,
like in a computer model.
Okay.
And so this line of work has, I think at the moment is in a pretty fertile place. There's a lot of experimental and theoretical modeling around these ideas. I'm not saying they were started by me. There were like a bunch of people working on this at the same time. And so but it feels like kind of interesting intersections. Really asking, if you zoom out it, saying what are the large-scale organizational principles of the brain? Why does one part of the brain do something, another part of the brain do something else? Is there some sort of organizational principle that lays out that plan? And then for my postdoc, I kind of split into the two pieces I talked about earlier. In one piece, I was studying a number of questions related to how the brain can efficiently compute and communicate using, let me say that again. So you have some very large network of neurons, maybe millions of neurons. Some of them can talk to each other, some of them can't. And you're trying to understand basic principles that allow these networks to do things like store memories or make a decision. And one of the things you want to show is that, well, can they store memories or make a decision efficiently? So what does that mean? For storing memories, you might say, well, I've got this big network of neurons. They need to store memories. They need to store a lot of memories. Just, over the course of our life, we need to remember lots of things. How can they do that in a way that lets them retrieve the memory and also pack in as many memories as possible without them overwriting each other? So, maybe you've gone to a friend's house a few times. Ideally, you'd like at least some of those episodes to be distinct. You don't want them all just to collapse together. And so I did some work using, I think some very interesting ideas in computer science, looking at properties of large networks, and systems for error correction built on large networks, using those to try to understand how the brain might store memories. I guess I'm not being super clear about the general idea here, and I think it's because I don't completely understand it well enough to make it simple. I think once you understand an idea well enough to make.
But in general, I guess, I have been to some of your talks before, but the general idea is that there is a trade-off between being able to store many memories and between being able to retrieve any one of those very accurately. So if you devote a bunch of resources and storage capacity, let's say, to 3 memories, you would expect that you should be able to retrieve each one of them fairly accurately given some sort of a prompt or cue.
Yeah.
But using that same storage capacity, if you're storing 1,000 different memories, then when trying to retrieve them, you could retrieve one that's kind of similar. But not so the accuracy they could start to interfere.
And it could be less robust. Like imagine you have a book, you want to write down your memories.
Yeah.
If you want to make really sure you remember something, you could write it down 100 times.
Yeah.
But then you have less space to store the other memories.
Yeah.
And so there's this pretty general trade-off between how many things you can store and how well you can store them.
So would it be fair to say that you used ideas from computer science theory and math to explore how you could possibly build the architecture for a brain to have a reasonable trade-off between the accuracy and the storage capacity?
Yeah, I think that's right. And not just reasonable, in some sense, we showed that brains can perform just as well as the best computer algorithms, at least qualitatively. So, the storage capacity, they kind of hit the ideal capacity robustness trade-off.
Yeah.
And I think what I'm really excited about in this work is there are these interesting objects called expander graphs that pop up in a lot of math and computer science. And again, I think we have some reason for understanding why. We have some intuition for why they're so important, but I don't think we understand it completely. But they're basically these large, weakly connected networks with not too many connections that end up having a lot of interesting mathematical properties that show up, to me, in still mysterious ways in a lot of different problems. And I think one of the cool things about them is they were introduced by Kolmogorov, we think, to model the brain.
To model the brain.
To model neuron packing in the brain.
Okay.
And it
he was around roughly when?
Like early to mid 20th century.
Okay.
And they've had this interesting, they've had a lot of impact in math and computer science, but they're a very natural way for thinking about computation in the brain. And they're a very natural way. They've been used elsewhere in math and computer science to kind of bridge this sort of structure. They're both these networks, so they have a structure, and they're used to design algorithms. And that's exactly the sort of question we're sort of thinking about neuroscience. How do the connections between neurons give rise to the computations they can do? There was one project I worked on. There were a couple of others. There was another where we used a bunch of geometric techniques to effectively find shapes in data. And we used these techniques to look at data from mice brains when they were awake and when they were asleep, and trying to investigate how they maintain their sense of direction. And so, within all of us, we think there's a little circuit that keeps track of which way we're facing. And so if you're in your room, I can say point to the door, and you can, even if you're not looking at the door. How do you maintain that sense of direction? There are a bunch of ideas, but being able to actually test those ideas in data requires both enough data and ways of pulling the structure out. And it turns out that if you look at these circuits when the animal's asleep, that kind of gives you a very clean, in some ways, experimental condition. It's almost like a natural experiment. Because when the animal's awake and the circuit's working as it's expected to, you can't really tell what's internal, what's external, what's coming from the outside world, what's being generated by the animal. But when it's asleep, it's almost like you've snipped the input to the circuit. And now you can actually see how it's wired up without all of this external input coming in. And so you can actually kind of see its bones.
One might ask the question, when the animal is asleep and it's not really looking around the room, it's not changing its head direction, why would there be any activity in this part of the brain in the first place?
So maybe there's sort of a two-part answer to that question. The first is that, neurons tend to fire when you're asleep. They're kind of organized with certain connections. Those connections are still there when you're asleep. And so those things just randomly activate. Kind of the same way that when you're dreaming, you see all these images and things like that. And part of the reason we think is that, the same neurons are talking to each other. The same neurons are active. And so you basically have the same patterns. And it turns out there's a lot of overlap between at least one kind of sleep called REM sleep and waking. I think there's maybe a deeper and more interesting question, like why do we have REM sleep at all? It seems, if the purpose of sleep is to refresh us, why not just turn off the neurons? Or why don't the neurons do something different? And at least during another kind of sleep called non-REM sleep or slow wave sleep, neurons do something quite different. But during REM sleep, the puzzling thing about REM sleep is our brain spends a lot of time in it, and it does what looks to be very similar to waking, and it's not at all clear why. So in many ways, I think REM sleep is the more mysterious one.
You wanted to talk about something that you described as distributed computing in biological systems, and in the same point you mentioned the link between matter and information.
Yes, I think this is kind of a broader trope that maybe got me interested in biology in general. But if you just look, what makes the brain more interesting than the liver? Not to really criticize people who study the liver. And I think it's, on the one hand, the brain is this hunk of biological tissue with a bunch of electrical activity that's kind of moving around. And we can ask, how does electrical activity get from one place to another and so on? But from another level, it's doing something. It has a function that's not just maintaining a level of something, it actually seems like we can think about it as transforming some information. If you have an input, you have an output. We can think about it using the language of computing and computation. We can bring in ideas of representation of the outside world, which I think is, a dangerous idea, but an interesting one. We can come back to that.
Okay.
And so there are these multiple levels of seeing this biological system. On the one hand, it's this piece of matter. On the other hand, it's this information processing device. And I think there's a lot of interesting creative tension moving between these two levels. And then the distributed computing piece comes back to this idea of how do millions of neurons really do anything when, they don't have, I think they're kind of like interesting ways in which they don't have organizing centers. There's no spatial organizing center. There's no, single entity telling each what to do. There's also not that much, there's also an interesting kind of instability over time. Neurons come and go, connections weaken and strengthen. How do we get any sense of permanence or memory or time on this kind of shifting system? So there's a lack of an organizing center in space, there's a lack of an organizing center in time. And then they're really strongly coupled to the world. It's not that, I don't think of the brain as being this abstract entity separate from the world. Everything's happening in response to this constant stream of information coming in, actions going out, and even the in and out distinction, I think, is a bad one. And so, anything interesting that happens emerges in some way, and it's not quite clear how.
What did you mean by the link between matter and information?
Really just this idea that you can think about these systems as somehow material, and from this information theoretic level,
Okay.
which is kind of an abstract level.
Why did you say that the idea of thinking about representations of the outside world in the brain is a dangerous idea?
I don't know, or maybe I think it has the potential to be misleading. I think it's very useful, but I think, there's there's a Brecht quote that I like to repurpose, and so he says, art is not a mirror with which to reflect the world. It is a hammer with which to shape it. And I think the same is true of the brain. I mean, the brain didn't evolve to build abstract representations of trees and chairs. The brain evolved to act in the world. A useful way to study it is to say, well, let's separate out the world from the brain. Assume that as part of acting well in the world, the brain builds abstract representations and manipulates them, and then uses them to drive outputs.
But it builds the representations only to the extent that being able to work on that representation gives it some usable benefit.
Yeah, and I think one can make an even stronger point that sometimes the search for representations can be misleading. Because if you believe that representations are a good way to study the brain, and they often are, I think, but if you believe that, then you go looking for representations, you try and judge how accurate those representations are, or maybe try and judge what they're there for, but you've kind of lost, you've often separated out the environment, you've separated out behavior, you've separated out the organism, and you've kind of taken this perspective that you can kind of abstract the representation from the whole interacting system. And I think that can be misleading. And a lot of people have pointed this out. I think, like, for example, the pragmatists take a view of the brain very much in terms of, we've got these sensory motor loops running through us. We had these kind of, we're really completely intertwined with the world. If you're looking for representations, I think you often neglect how much information there actually is outside in the world, and like whether you actually need to. And then I also think that the notion of information can sometimes be misleading, because then you sort of frame things in terms of these input-output devices, which again the brain is not. Most of what our brain is doing is just kind of like seamlessly acting as part of a world, and then you can kind of snip it and try and look at the pieces. I think you have to be careful when you do it.
Thank you for joining us today in the Room of Lives. In the next episode, we talk about Rishi's philosophical trajectory as it relates to the science of the mind, and about the question of consciousness in a material world.